You have a sink, I have a sink, we all have sinks, and so we all have a similar problem. Our sink cabinets tend to be one of the worst areas of any kitchen. At the end of the video, I'm going to give you what I think is the absolute best way to configure a sink cabinet so that you can have the most functional use of that space. First, let's identify some of the pain points and some of the problems that we have with sink cabinets. Plumbing is a big issue. There's a lot of pipes inside that cabinet that can really get in the way of it being usable. Depending on the type of sink you have, depending on how many drains you have, and depending on how many faucets you have, whether you have a hot water faucet and things like that, will determine how much space is going to be used up by plumbing. And then of course you have dishwasher tie-ins and maybe other things that incorporate into the sink drain and the sink water supply lines. Not only do they take up space, but they're points of breakage or possible problems for water leaks down the road. Clutter is a huge deal underneath a sink. Rat poison underneath there, along with vinegar, along with scrubby brushes and maybe dog food, and who knows, where did all this stuff come from? I hardly ever use it because there's stuff way in the back in there and it's hard to access and it's kind of grimy and frustrating. Most sink cabinets are not accessible. There's no thought put into making this cabinet not something that you have to get on your hands and knees to crawl in under. Now there's a couple reasons for this. One, you have to get in there to install your sink and install your plumbing, so the more installations of things in that cabinet, the harder it's going to be for you or a plumber or whomever to get into that cabinet to fix something if you have to. However, having some kind of mechanism in there would be very beneficial to access the things in the back of that cabinet that are generally more difficult to access. And if you're like myself, you have your garbage underneath your sink, and so there's some kind of garbage pull-out mechanism, or maybe it's just a bin in that cabinet along with maybe a small compostable bin. That can get really grimy and really dirty, and another reason why this sink cabinet can tend to be just one of those areas that is plus you add in some UV filters or some other type of water filters or a garburator, and before you know it, the whole thing is just clogged up with stuff that's very useful and usable and you do appreciate it, but it makes that cabinet much more difficult to access. And then of course there's the size of the sink cabinet itself. We want to have a sink cabinet that's big enough to obviously fit the sink, but not too big that it takes up more room than necessary, taking away from space for other usable cabinets like drawer banks or whatever. So because the sink cabinet is not the most accessible, the most functional cabinet, it tends to get the least amount of attention. So maybe the sink cabinet will never be the pride of the kitchen, but it doesn't have to be like the rear end of the kitchen either. It can be much more usable, and there's a few ways I think that we can do this. And going back to the size of the sink cabinet, I don't think there's anything wrong with making it maybe just a little bit bigger. Just give ourselves a little bit more room for what we're going to add to that cabinet to make it more functional. I think the first thing we should consider adding to our sink cabinet is a liner for the bottom. This will save a ton of headaches down the road in the event that something spills or there's a leak from the plumbing underneath the sink. Having a liner underneath that you can pull out and clean off and get the water out of there is a really good idea that seldom gets thought about when you are purchasing a kitchen. You should always request that, especially if you're ordering a kitchen from wherever it's being custom made, or even if it's something off the shelf, even if you're buying a ready to assemble unit like IKEA, so that in the future when a spill happens or a leak happens, you don't ruin the bottom of that cabinet or create an environment for mold to grow. They're quite easy to install. I'll add a link to one in the description below. If you want to purchase one and put it in your existing sink cabinet, I highly recommend that you do that. Now, the biggest thing you can consider under your sink cabinet is to allow yourself some functionality by adding some kind of pull-out mechanism or some kind of door attached mechanism that you can help yourself by storing things, that everything's not all cluttered, that everything has a space. What that does is not only make it easier to access, but it kind of allows you to inventory what's in that cabinet so that there's stuff not just piled in the back that gets forgotten about. It's actually easy to get at when it needs to be replaced, or something that can be stored in the back there can easily be stored by pulling out the whole unit. Now, this is going to differ for everybody because all of us have a different sink cabinet configuration, and the plumbing and all the stuff that we talked about earlier can be in the way, and this can cause problems. There's a variety of different options out there, and at least I would recommend that you go out, measure the space that is available under your sink cabinet, and go and find something, whether it's in a hardware store or online somewhere, that you can go and install with ease. If you're a homeowner and you're not renovating your kitchen, but you want to just make this space better, is just to address some of these simple issues. And overall, that makes your kitchen more enjoyable to work in. If you have some kind of great idea as you're watching this video that like, oh, he didn't mention this, put it in the comments, let everybody know so that we can all benefit from your knowledge knowledge as well as mine so we can have the best sink cabinets possible. What about flip down trays? I'm not a fan of the flip down tray that can be installed. Normally this would be installed in a new kitchen. It's not something generally you'd retrofit, but it can be. It's the false front on your sink cabinet if you have one that can flip down and there's trays inside, whether plastic or metal, whether two or one, big long one. On just the functionality side, it does add that little bit of extra storage for things that maybe don't have a home, a scrub brush or, a scrubbing pad, something like that. But just be aware that there are some certain problems with them, being that they don't dry out properly and kind of get grimy. If not done right, you can just introduce water to the inside of your cabinet that way. Installing drawers instead of just two big doors and an open space is a great way to do a sink cabinet, but it has to be really pre-planned out because of the plumbing. Now, the only problem with this that I have is that generally the front, the whole door tends to pull out and you have to get access from the sides when you do that. And this can also maybe be a little bit of a hassle if you have to get in that cabinet. But overall, I think having a drawer underneath that space is a really good idea. Makes it even easier to access this stuff because you don't have to open a door and pull out some kind of tray. Lots of ways to do this, whether the drawer is customized to fit around the plumbing or whether the plumbing is into the back wall instead of through the floor and you have the floor space in the cabinet. But it's something to look at and to consider. Even if you are not renovating your kitchen, you can go right now, look in that space and say, is there a way that we could retrofit and install a drawer instead of having the two doors? Pull-out garbage bins, definitely something that I recommend under the sink, but with some caution. They do get grimy. Make sure that it's a pull-out one, not one that you have to get in and get at. You might be dealing with all kinds of plumbing and all kinds of issues, so you have to deal with what you have, but there's always ways that you can look at that to make that a little bit better, even if you have to redo the plumbing. Now that's a big one, and obviously you're probably not going to do that yourself unless you're very handy and you're okay with doing that kind of work, but I don't recommend it. I'm not saying you should. You should definitely hire somebody. It might be something you could consider if underneath the plumbing's kind of just a mess. There can be ways to tighten that up to make it so that it's more functional for you to use. And then of course the kind of current trend is not to have doors at all, but to have these curtains that go on the sink base. Seems to be something that I see in a lot of different pictures from designers. It certainly saves you the hassle of having to replace cabinet doors, so maybe it's a plus for that reason. And it's also maybe beneficial because it probably will allow more airflow in that cabinet in the event that water gets in the base. Now the best way to do a sink cabinet, according to me, little larger sink cabinet than standard. So if it's 36 is what it calls for, go with a 39. I'm a fan of a large single. I don't like doubles, I don't like small singles, all that stuff. So if you're dead against having a single bowl sink and you want a double, then I have another way we could probably do this. Large single bowl sink, which has one drain, and that drain should be offset. Right or the left, it really doesn't matter. The plumbing is also offset by default. And if the plumbing is offset and you plan for that with the rough ends of the plumbing, you can create for yourself a ton of space on the base of that cabinet that is very usable. So lots of space for pullouts, lots of space for garbage pullouts, lots of space for just adding things into that sink cabinet that are going to make your life easier. And when done correctly and when pre-planned, can create the absolute best sink cabinet scenario that I can think of. Now, if you have a double sink or you just love double sinks and you want to go that route, instead of plumbing it in the center where the drains go out like this, have it offset as well. So you have your main drain and then you have the plumbing from the other sink bowl coming down to that. So essentially it's doing the same type of thing as the single bowl, and you're creating more space. You might just not have as much vertical height. If you are planning a renovation for your kitchen, check out my online kitchen design solution where we work together to design your kitchen to be the most functional space possible. There's a link in the description. So now that you have the best scenario for a sink cabinet, the question remains, where should my sink cabinet go? Where's the best location? And what's the best kind of sink for that cabinet? And if you're wondering those questions, I have a playlist that you can check out all about sinks to answer those exact questions. See you in the next one.